Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
When Theresa May became Prime Minister last year, she said that she wanted to tackle burning injustices in society, like racial inequality. And today she's launching the government's new Race Disparity Audit. Mrs May says the information in the audit will be an essential resource in the battle to defeat ethnic injustice. It will pull together thousands of statistics on more than 130 topics, including how people from different backgrounds fare in terms of health, education, employment and criminal justice. It will include statistics showing that employment rates are higher for white people than for ethnic minorities. And people from ethnic minorities are also underrepresented in senior public sector jobs. All the data will be published on a new Ethnicity, Facts and Figures website. The Prime Minister says that society must explain or change why inequalities exist. On top of the audit, the government have announced some new policies, like mentoring schemes, to help people from ethnic minorities into work. But the Labour Party say that government cuts since 2010 have disproportionately affected people from minority groups, and that far from tackling burning injustices, Theresa May has added fuel to the fire. We're joined now from Central Lobby in the Houses of Parliament by Dawn Butler. She's the Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equalities. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Dawn Butler, Theresa May says that this new audit and website will be an essential resource in tackling racial injustice. Do you broadly welcome the fact the government is actually publishing all this data?
I welcome that the data is being collated and published. I think there's real value in that. But I think what would be valuable would be if there were some solutions attached to the problems that have been identified. For decades now, we've had reports after reports after reports. What we haven't had are solutions and progress and stages that the government's willing to take.
And what solutions would you be offering? You've now seen this data, you've said that this data has been here for some time. What solutions is the Labour Party offering?
Well, it took the government 14 months to collect the data,
Sure.
and it was a detailed exercise. I appreciate that. But remember, Theresa May called a snap election. In that time, we managed to produce a manifesto that not only highlighted some of the problems, but gave some solutions to the problems, and I can read some of them out to you: introducing equal pay audits, having impact assessments, which is what we had very early on, before David Cameron decided that they were just red tape.
So would you use this data yourselves, and I accept you've got your manifesto there, but would you use this data yourselves if you were to form the next government as the basis of tackling some of the injustices that are underlined?
To be honest, we wouldn't need to use the data because we'll be too busy tackling the issues with solutions. What we need is solutions. We don't need that. We know the data's there. Okay, some people might want to see this data and say we need this empirical evidence, but we know the data's there. What we don't know are what the solutions are, and what we don't know is what this government's going to do to tackle those solutions. What Theresa May has done on her watch is implemented policies which have disproportionately affected women and black and minority ethnic people and disabled people in a real damaging way that has damaged their lives.
Right.
Every policy that they've put forward has exacerbated this problem. That's not good governance.
And can you remind us then how much money the Labour manifesto committed to reversing some of those cuts?
So the thing is about the Labour Party manifesto, and I'm not going to get into a numbers game with you, right, Joe, because that's not what I'm here for.
But would you reverse the cuts then, broadly? Would you want to see those cuts reversed? Broadly, would you be trying to correct the injustices that you've outlined by reversing the cuts that you see as very unfair and prejudicial?
We made that very clear in our manifesto.
Well, only £4 billion a year in welfare.
Very clear in our manifesto. We made that very clear in the campaign. £4 billion was actually to correct the pay cap that has been forced on public sector workers. And we've said that we would invest that £4 million to reverse the pay cap. There are many other policies in our manifesto that would help the situation, such as
introducing
a real living wage, not the fake living wage of this government, but a real living wage of £10 an hour, which will help to lift people out of poverty. All of these policies are vital if we are going to tackle the burning injustices that the Prime Minister spoke about on the steps of number 10.
All right, let's have a look at the broad picture of the data, because you've said it is useful, you're pleased it's been published. But it is a mixed picture, isn't it? White British pupils on free school meals at Key Stage 2 performed worse than any other group, with only 32% reaching the expected level. But 71% of Chinese pupils, on the other hand, met the expected standard. So it's not straightforward, is it, to say that these inequalities are as a direct result of racial discrimination?
Well, what we need is, number one, an equality framework, so that we can see what we need to do in order to make sure how we work as a country is fair and equal. The second thing that we need to do is ensure that we have impact assessments on government policy. So we look at government policies and how it will impact different groups. Those are the steps and strategies that need to be taken if we're really going to tackle the injustices. It's fine to highlight the injustices, but the truth is, how are we going to tackle them? What's the processes? What are the solutions? What are the policies? You know, it's just not good enough just to highlight the issues.
OK, well, let's talk on this. So do you think that there is a high level of racial discrimination in public services and in society at large?
Yes, there is, and that's been proven by the data that's out today, but it's also been proven by people's life experiences, and it's many different things. It can be class, you know, that people are discriminated against. It could be colour, it can be sex, and what we want to do, and what we should strive to do, is to have a country that works for the many and not the few. Have a country that's equal and fair, so that everybody can fulfil their full potential, because that's what makes a good country. So that's what we all want.
Dawn Butler, thank you very much for joining us. And in the studio here is the Justice Minister, Sam Gyimah. Welcome back to the Daily Politics. Do you think all these different outcomes are mainly as a result of racial discrimination?
We don't know. And what the data's doing is, the government has done is publish data on outcomes. And what it's showing is the disparity in the outcomes. And as you said a few minutes ago, if you look at the outcomes for white working class boys, in terms of their educational attainment, it is a lot worse than, say, Chinese or Asian boys. So you can't say that it's as a result of racial discrimination. But what we do know from the data is that what is happening in our public services and the outcomes on different people needs to be investigated further.
Right, but you say you can't necessarily say it's as a result of discrimination. But, for example, the audit points to almost twice as many black and Asian people being unemployed as white people. How big a factor is racial discrimination in that statistic, do you think?
I think we've got to look into it. There are many reasons why this could be happening. So, for example, educational attainment could be an issue. If you look at the education bit, the number of kids that end up being excluded could ultimately impact it. So it's a whole conveyor belt. So you can't point to one single thing and say...
Or is discrimination all the way along the line?
I think the important thing about this is, and what I particularly like is, in government, what gets measured is what gets done. And that's the lesson here.
Except, we just heard from Dawn Butler, we've had this data, we've had it since 2010, because Theresa May made her statement, and I paraphrase, that she guessed there were injustices affecting black and ethnic minority communities, you know, right from 2010. So we've had this data, and it hasn't been dealt with.
I think the scale, the scope and the level of transparency here is unprecedented. And if we are going to actually deal with this, we do, unlike what Dawn Butler says, we don't need the data. You do need the data. If you look at, again, taking the education...
Well, she said she was pleased that the data had been published. She just said it has been there for some time and the government hasn't done anything about it. Well,
there is a lot that is going on. What this says is that we've come a long way since, I would say, since 1948, when the SS Windrush landed on the shores of
one would
Tilbury.
hope so.
But there is still more work to be done, and we are being open and honest about it. And I think it wouldn't come across as a surprise to anyone to say that there are parts of communities in our country where the impact of public services on them is a big issue. Now, if we look at, and I don't think there's any different to talking about the gender pay gap. We should be comfortable talking about the gender pay gap. We've shined a light on it, and that would lead to improvements. And doing this and shining a light here would also lead to improvements.
Well, what do you make then of the comments from Munira Mirza, who's the former Deputy Mayor of London under Boris Johnson, that this audit, in her words, is crude and tendentious, and the government is promoting a grievance culture? You're stoking up grievances between communities. Is that fair?
I don't think communities need to read this report to know that somehow the impact of these services on them has been disadvantageous. This is the reality of their daily lives. And I see where Munira is coming from. But I think, look, as a Conservative Party, I want us to speak to all parts of Britain. I want us to embrace modern Britain completely. And this allows us to have a solid foundation on which we can come up with more policies to actually build a more cohesive
All right,
society.
so I've heard there are going to be hotspots that are identified and mentoring. Are those the big answers to the big burning injustices that have been exposed by shining a light on this?
I don't think anyone today is talking about the answers. I think the focus on today is doing what hasn't been done before. And what is important here, before we get into a listorama of policies, is I think an approach that says you've got to explain why the difference exists, or you've got to change, which is the approach that Theresa May has outlined. And I think that would lead to a step change. I mean, going back to Munira's point, it was Douglas Hurd, a Conservative Home Secretary, who first looked at publishing data in the criminal justice system in 1991. Not much has been done. So it's clearly having the data is important, but to have actually change, we've got to have a different attitude and culture in our public services.
The data's being published and a light is being shone on how different groups are dealt with in public services. But if there is no concrete action to deal with it, and I haven't yet heard, beyond the few examples I gave, any big policy changes, then what's going to change?
One of the things that's already changed is people like Sam are in Parliament. He mentioned Douglas Hurd a few minutes ago. When Douglas Hurd was standing up in the House of Commons, it was almost entirely white. There are now more people like Sam and people from different ethnic backgrounds across the House of Commons in all parties. That's good. And, of course, you don't have to be black or Asian to understand these kinds of injustice. But I think now, throughout government and opposition, the people who perhaps have experienced what are real prejudices in Britain. David Cameron, in his party conference speech a couple of years ago, said if you have a foreign-sounding name on your CV, it makes you less likely to get a job. If you have more people in Parliament, as we do now, fortunately, who have felt these issues as well as read about them, the action will flow. And yes, we haven't got a listorama, to use your nice expression, of policies today, but I think it's good that this issue is being moved up the agenda by this initiative.
How much is it to do with cuts, as Dawn Butler said? I mean, a study from the Runnymede Trust said that the poorest black households are going to lose £8,400 a year over the course of this decade as a result of government policies.
I think that's just Labour trying to politicise what is a very long-standing and complex issue.
Well, the study's from the Runnymede Trust.
No, but just going back to the... For example, I look after prisons. We have a higher number of white males that commit suicide in prison. That's something that's come out of the data, right? And so to isolate the different bits of the data and actually deal with them, you can't say it's all down to cuts.
All right, well, let's talk about the economy.
And look at Labour sort of spending, hearing, Dawn Butler. What are their priorities, for example? Things like tuition fees, which overwhelmingly benefit middle-class white people. So they can't just criticise say it's all about public spending when their own spending priorities are not the people that this data is
and
highlighting.
all spending priorities will be dictated to by the state of the economy. And the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, looks set to downgrade growth forecasts. Does it worry you that the OBR are implying they'll reduce growth forecasts already, and that's before we leave the EU, possibly without a deal?
In terms of what we've done for working people across the board, I think raising the personal allowance so that you pay less in income tax if you're lower than skill,
which overwhelmingly benefits now higher income families. It doesn't benefit lower income people anymore.
But it makes a huge difference to
not
people.
To the most
the living wage.
Not to the most disadvantaged.
Makes a huge difference. So, but I think this is a very nuanced report.
Well, it's not nuanced because it's citing poor productivity growth, and it'll hit.
The OBR.
Well, and yes, the OBR and the productivity growth will hit GDP to such an extent it could wipe out the £26 billion war chest that Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, has set aside for any Brexit-related economic troubles. So, is this really the time to be bullish about no deal?
I think any government should prepare for every eventuality, as anyone should do in a negotiation. And I think it's right for the government to make it clear that it is preparing for every eventuality. And I think when they go to the negotiation table, that gives them more confidence that whatever the outcome, that they've got the plans in place.
All right, Samjima, thank you.
The government has published its audit of how people from different backgrounds are treated by public services in the UK. The figures show disparities across the board in health, employment, education and treatment by police and the courts. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, who commissioned the audit, says public services will have to now explain or change any differences in the way people are treated. But critics claim just releasing the figures doesn't offer any actual solutions. Our Home editor Mark Easton has been taking a look.
The many faces of multiracial Britain. But despite decades of efforts to improve equality between races, there are still big differences in people's life experiences.
If you're black, you're treated more harshly by the criminal justice system.
On her first day as Prime Minister, Theresa May pledged to fight the burning injustices of racial disparity and instructed officials to comb Whitehall for any relevant facts and figures held by government departments. 300 data sets were found, and this afternoon 60 of those were put on a dedicated website. They're not new figures, but they are now in one place.
We've got the data, we've had it before. The key question is, what are we going to do about it? And that's the question for government. White working class communities left behind, black and ethnic minorities languishing in the job centre, failing in schools. What are we going to do? What's the action that's going to flow from having all this data on one website?
There are differences in almost every area of public life. In education, while 71% of Chinese pupils in England reach the expected standard in reading, writing and maths aged 11, among white British pupils it's 54%, and for white Gypsy and Roma children it's 13%. In housing in England, the proportion of white British senior managers who own their own home is 82%. Among senior managers from other ethnic groups, it's 55%. In jobs, a focus on the West Midlands reveals 5% of white people are unemployed, but among people from other ethnic groups, it's 11%. Coventry is one of 20 hotspots identified by the audit, and new measures are being introduced to reduce the disparity.
It shouldn't be about the groups, it should be just about, are you capable of doing what you need to do? That's it.
I haven't felt it myself, but I know a lot of people have, so the majority would suffer inequality, yeah.
What's there to be worried about? Like, I'm still at university, I've got a year left, so just get a good grade and hopefully see what happens.
Prime Ministers often complain how difficult it is actually to change things. So this race audit is really a tool for Theresa May to get her ministers to focus on an issue she wants to define her premiership. Explain or change is the order. If there's no reason for a racial disparity, change your policies.
Then this is a problem that I believe that we have to confront.
Race equality campaigners from across Britain were inside 10 Downing Street today, glad that the issue is back at the heart of government.
These are complicated matters that cost the nation a lot of money, and those who are victims to these injustices, it costs them in terms of life chances. So complicated they might be, but we can't afford to ignore them.
Costly and complicated. There are no quick fixes to issues which have been debated in Parliament for decades. The problems are well known. The solutions often remain elusive. Mark Easton, BBC News, Westminster.
When Theresa May became PM, she pledged to tackle the burning injustices in society and demanded that public services explain or change racial inequality. 15 months on, we have her racial disparity audit, showing, among many things, that black Caribbean children are 3 times more likely to be excluded from school than white children, and unemployment for black and Asian people is nearly double that of white adults. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Darshna Soni, with a look at the findings.
Florence Nightingale, we all know about her, but there's also a lady called Mary Seacole, and they worked foot to foot, hand in hand, and they did that work together. Well, she was not mentioned in history, but today...
It's Black History Month, and Abba Graham is keen to teach these young people about African and Caribbean role models.
This is why Black history is important.
3/4 of black primary school pupils here in Stockport don't reach the expected standard in reading, writing and maths. It's the lowest in the country, and is partly why Mrs Graham founded this centre 8 years ago. She isn't surprised by the findings of today's audit into racial disparity.
we don't have a voice. So because we don't have a voice, we just left. We practically just left. What we teach them here is about being proud of who they are.
The race audit didn't commission any new research. All of the information is already in the public domain and has long been debated, but it's the first time it's been collated together. The audit highlights disparities across all areas. It shows unemployment among Black, Asian and other ethnic minorities is around 8%. That's nearly double that of white British adults. When it comes to living standards, around 1 in 4 children in households from an Asian background live in poverty, compared to 1 in 10 from a white British household. But the audit also reveals inequalities for white children, revealing that white teenagers are 4 times more likely to smoke than black teenagers. So these findings are nothing new. As Theresa May herself has admitted, people who have lived with discrimination don't need an audit to reveal the scale of the challenge. What critics want to know is, what is the government going to do about it?
I think it's a very significant day for our country.
Mrs May said that organisations will be challenged to explain or change the findings. The Prime Minister launched the audit at a diversity event, attended by a selected group of equality campaigners.
We need to understand what is effective in this arena. We've been doing lots of things for lots of years, and it's been a drip feed. So the scale of change and the pace of change is what we need to be thinking about.
One of the few practical measures announced today was the creation of regional hotspots to help ethnic minorities into work. That's something welcomed at the Stockport Community Centre. 32-year-old Nathan Askill is a trained care worker but has struggled to find work. He says it's difficult to explain why he feels it's down to prejudice, but it's something he's been aware of.
Sometimes it just feels like it's unreachable. And it's no fault of any certain person. And as we're talking about the system, I feel like it's just the way it's set up. You've got to go the long road round, and you can't achieve without overachieving, it feels like, anyways.
Abba Graham wants the government to fund practical solutions. She has spent decades working in this community and doesn't want to be going over the same arguments again in decades to come.
And I just feel it's so sad that I'm sitting here with you, 2017, talking about the same issues that we talk about yesteryears, the things that Martin Luther King fought for, the thing that Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison for. What are we talking about?
Having published the data, the government now has to show what it's going to do with it to create a society in which all individuals can reach their full potential. Darshna Soni, Channel 4 News, Stockport.
Well, joining us from Central Lobby in the House of Commons is the First Secretary of State, Damien Green. What was the most shocking fact that you didn't know about in this audit?
Well, there are huge numbers of facts. We've got 130 different data sets, many of which are very new. So, in fact, oddly enough, we asked people that. We've done a lot of research on this, and there's an enormous variety of answers depending, because what you find is that there isn't a sort of broad brush picture. There are some things that we know are bad. We know about, for instance, stop and search, and the likelihood of arrest is much more likely to affect black young men. We know on the other side that Chinese children tend to do better at school than white children.
What did you find shocking?
Well, some of it was shocking, some of it was counterintuitively good. For example, I had no idea that people from an Indian and Pakistani background are as likely to be homeowners as white British people.
Do you think that's a burning injustice?
I don't think it's a burning injustice. I think what that shows, and what we get from the audit, is that there are certainly injustices in our society, but also that we are a tolerant society. We're a society that is relatively successful at integrating new communities, and that over time there are the opportunities for those members of those communities to do as well as white British people. But there's far too much inequality, and what this audit enables us to do is to have the hard evidence of the type we haven't had collected in one place before, to enable us to take the policy solutions in individual areas, and very specifically in individual geographical areas. One of the most...
So who's going to do it? I mean, when you say individual geographical area, I mean, how is this going to happen, this
Well, it's going to happen,
ending of the injustice?
It's a good question. It is going to happen partly through central government action. For example, you talked about the unemployment hotspots, so the Department for Work and Pensions will be doing that. But it's partly a job for local government as well. And some of these things about wage differences and so on are clearly something that the private sector will have to play a role in, because what the audit does is not just impose, if you like, challenges to central government, which we absolutely accept, but it holds a mirror up to the whole of society, so that public sector and private sector bodies will clearly have to improve their performance in these specific areas that we've now identified.
I mean, it does sound like you haven't been very surprised by anything, and that is one of the criticisms that anybody who knows about this stuff, and anybody from an ethnic minority knows all this stuff, well, most of it, and they didn't need another audit. What they needed was ideas to try and solve it. And that's what's lacking today.
Nobody has known all of this stuff in the past, because some of it is new information. And actually today we have made the first few policy proposals. Of course there will be a lot more, but apart from the unemployment one we've mentioned, the Department for Education is getting an external body to look at exclusions, because one of the unfairnesses seems to be that different groups are more likely to be excluded from school than other groups, and indeed we found a degree of inequality in school that we need to deal with. And other departments, the Justice Department, for instance, is again going to ensure that the prison officer population reflects much more the population at large. Those are the kind of practical measures that will change.
I saw you in the Commons today, and there was a moment where you were telling a group of black women, Labour MPs, that they didn't know what they were talking about when it came to discrimination. I wondered whether that felt at all uncomfortable for you.
I wasn't telling a group of anyone anything. I was disagreeing with my Labour opposite spokesman, who I think was
Dawn Butler and Diane Abbott.
It was very specifically Dawn Butler who was responding to me, and you know, she disagreed with what I had to say, and I disagreed with what she had to say. But you know, that's what happens in Parliament. The fact that Dawn is a woman and black is of no relevance to this. I'm not quite sure what point you're making, Christian. Are you being sexist or racist on this?
No, I'm just wondering how it felt telling. You know, if you look at the pictures, seem to tell a story in that moment. But
no. What the picture tells a story of is that I was saying what I think about what she'd said, just as she'd said what she thought about what I'd said. It's full parliamentary debate. The fact that I'm white and she's black, that she's a woman, I'm a man, is completely irrelevant to that. And to suggest that is itself slightly dubious, Krishnan.
Let me ask you about one other thing while we have with you, because Theresa May's caused a big fuss today by refusing to answer a question about Brexit, in which she was asked, if there was a referendum tomorrow, would you vote the same way? So can I ask you the same question? If there was a referendum tomorrow, would you still vote Remain?
Well, I was on the board of the Stronger In campaign, so my views on Europe are well known, and I don't resile from anything I said during the election campaign. But of course the fact is it's a meaningless question, because there's not going to be a referendum tomorrow, so it's a purely hypothetical question.
Damien Green, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, one of the areas coming under the most scrutiny in the audit was education. Our reporter Fatima Manji has been to meet students at a predominantly non-white school to ask them about race, inequality and how it affects them and their peers.
We've assembled our own panel to get their verdict on racial inequality. They're not political pundits or politicians, but high-flying British teenagers who live in one of the poorest boroughs of the country.
Hi, my name's Iram, I'm 17 and I'm a British Pakistani.
My name's Joe, I'm 18 and I'm English and Lithuanian.
Hi, my name's Namitha, I'm 17 and I'm Indian.
My name's Mohammed, I'm 17 and I'm African.
My name is Mira, I'm 17 and I'm Indian.
I'm Eddie, I'm 17 and I'm from Kosovo.
These students expect to get great results, and yet they too are concerned at the disparities appearing in today's racial audit.
Quite a scary thought in a sense, because they could be exactly identical on paper but not get a job because of some sort of inbuilt or some sort of structural discrimination.
The people who are in charge of running the country, of running businesses these days, are the ones who have grown up with thinking of race as less of an issue. Unsurprising that there's going to be bias.
Overall, students from ethnic minority backgrounds are performing better in education.
So that when you go on to do something scientific at university, it won't be the first time you come across this sort of equipment.
They're more likely to progress to university than white pupils leaving state schools. And this sixth form college in Newham is part of that success story. 90% of the pupils are non-white. They go on to elite universities, not just in the UK, but also in the US. But there are still gaps nationally. Here's the percentage of students getting 3 grade A's at A-level. There's a clear gap between black and white pupils. And if you break down the Asian category, it's clear Pakistani and Bangladeshi students aren't faring so well. Worries over inequality drove head teacher Mohsin Ismail to set up the school. An East London boy himself, he left his job as a city lawyer to retrain as a teacher.
I realised when I started working in the city law firms, there weren't too many people like me or from a social background like mine. My parents are uneducated and therefore couldn't have those rich discussions or create that culture of learning in the household that you would probably get if you were a child of a middle-class parent. So I decided to come back to the community that I grew up in.
They teach a super curriculum: Latin, history of art, debate, education you would normally only get in the private sector. But here's the catch: only those with A's and B's at GCSE are admitted.
Aren't you just taking the top end away from the broader education system?
We're working with a particular type of student in a deprived area who for some time have been neglected, and therefore we're doing our bit to ensure that they are elevated.
Today's audit shows a complex story. While black Caribbean students are 3 times more likely to be excluded than white pupils, it's white students on free school meals who are getting the worst GCSE results.
Inequality is not just limited to racial inequality, and I feel like it's potentially the government just finding a way to avoid that issue.
Racialising isn't really a good idea because there's such a huge risk of sort of alienating sort of white working class people and all that.
So you're worried about a backlash?
It's a sensitive topic, so that's why I think everyone's really iffy about how to solve it.
I think homogenising inequality is a bit of a dangerous, slippery slope because then it does seem like a big, broad, widespread issue, whereas obviously it is, but tackling it would be easier if you dealt with it specifically. It's time to take some action and do something about it.
Well, I'm joined now by Labour's Roshanara Ali and Tony Sewell, founder of Generating Genius, which was set up to help students from disadvantaged communities get into top universities. And the Conservative MP, Kwasi Kwarteng, is also with us. Roshanara Ali, why is your side quite cross about this?
Well, the government has commissioned lots of reports. The Social Mobility Commission, led by Alan Milburn, highlighted the major socio-economic problems that need to be addressed. And this is yet another one, the Commission on Integration. There'll be another report coming out. And we feel pretty frustrated by the fact that the government hasn't really put much focus on where the problems can be addressed and how they can be addressed.
But don't you feel just publishing the numbers will in itself prompt action?
Well, the numbers have been published over and over again. You know, go back 10, 15 years. I mean, I've been working on these issues for a long time. The numbers on black boys, black Caribbean boys and white working class boys and their poor attainment levels is pretty much the same. It's been going on for a long time. Successive governments have done studies. What we need is action. And the second thing is that if the government put some effort into which policies had a negative impact on ethnic minorities and white working class young people, for instance, they would find that education maintenance cuts, FE funding cuts where predominantly working class and ethnic minority groups are concentrated, those policies have a detrimental effect on these groups that's the subject of the study. So instead of looking at the problem later, it's much better to use the legislative provision to do the impact assessment and put the preemptive action in place to stop this from happening. That's not been happening.
You've criticised this, but from a different perspective.
Yeah, I think the narrative is wrong. I think actually the word from 10 years ago, I would argue that in fact it's very positive. And in fact, what an audit like this does, it knocks out the kind of agency, the ability of, I think, young people in particular to really kind of own what is and celebrate really what is a positive story. I mean,
but there's
you've got to look.
What's wrong with pointing them out?
Well, I mean, there's not, you point out what you like, but I mean, the issue is what impact does it have? So, for example, you may well be, and it came out in that clip you had, you may be well feeding in to a notion of victimhood, a notion that basically I can't do because the general narrative, everybody is
saying. Do you really
that,
think black and Asian people think that?
Yes.
They feel like
without any doubt. I'll tell you why. I mean, my programme really kind of deals with that. Let me give you one.
I mean, I don't know.
I'll give you one clear example of how that works. It even works with kids. In that report, it talks about the arts, and it talks about actors and opening up the arts for a community and going after that. Really and truly, what are the real reasons why actors can't get work in Britain? Is it really about racism? When black actors have gone to America, what's really made them better than their American counterparts is they've been classically trained. They're better than their African-American counterparts.
Kwasi Kwarteng, you're getting it from both sides here.
Well, I think that a lot of what Tony is saying is right. I think there are positive stories. There's also a negative story. But it's an audit. It's not something that's going to say one thing or another. And I think what Roshanari's response showed was a certain churlishness, because this is the first time a government has actually taken a step like this to have an audit. I think, as you've seen, it's precipitated a large measure of debate. People are engaged in the issue. We're talking about it. We're here.
When you say you agree with Tony, I mean, you're saying you think it does feed a victim mentality?
I don't agree with that bit. I think there are positive stories. I mean, my parents came to Britain in the 1960s. I grew up in London in the 80s. We've come a long way as a society in dealing with a lot of these issues. Now, we haven't reached a point of perfection, but I think what the government is doing is a very credible, sober and intelligent way of trying to deal with these issues.
Kwasi, it's not churlish to point out that there are massive inequalities and talent is being wasted, and there is a responsibility for the government to address that. And I think that this report, while evidence is always welcome, it's repeating ground that's been covered for a long time. What we need focus on is dealing with the underlying problems that exist, and that's in educational attainment. We've made huge progress. In my constituency, we now have very high levels of attainment, but when people get to work, there's a lot of discrimination that kicks in. So the government needs to focus on the action. That is not churlish. It's about making sure that the response
And what do you
is there.
think of Tony Sewell's criticism?
Well, I think, I share Tony's points about making sure young people don't get stigmatised. They have role models, they have support, and they get they're able to fulfil their aspirations, and they're not constantly told they're disadvantaged. I went to a school.
There is a danger, though. There is a danger that you could get, and we see this particularly in the judicial system, where black men are more likely to plead guilty because they're suspicious of the system. And what you do is you get a sense that a lot of young people then, particularly from different ethnic backgrounds, just become so suspicious of the system they give up. They don't want to engage with it anymore, and they go somewhere else. And that's because you're continually pushing a narrative that black people can't succeed in this. That almost you're whispering in their ear that look, however hard you try in this, the system is stacked against you.
But isn't it honest to say to them, you might get to university, but you're less likely to get a job? That's just a fact. So you've got to do something about that.
But there's nothing wrong with saying that. But you see, it depends on how you see the world. And if in fact the word, I mean, certain lobby groups are coming out and saying that the world is framed in this way, you can't move on it.
Just very briefly.
I think that this audit is to be welcomed. I think the fact that we're sitting around here having a debate, we're talking very frankly about difficult issues. We haven't mentioned the fact that social class also has an element in this. We haven't addressed that. But I think this is a healthy part of democracy, and I think the audit, the government audit, should be welcomed for that reason.
We must leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed.
So, Theresa May has kept a promise she made soon after becoming Prime Minister to get an audit done of how people from ethnic minorities are treated when it comes to health, education, jobs, and indeed by the police and by the courts. We learned the results this lunchtime, though not necessarily what should be done to correct the deep inequalities they have thrown up. Labour demanded solutions. The research found 8% of black, Asian and minority ethnic people were unemployed. That is nearly double the rate of white British adults. On education, of the poorest children receiving free school meals, white British children perform worse, in fact, than any other ethnic group. Only 32% reached the expected standard at the end of primary school. The report also found that whilst 3 out of 5 white British households own their own home, for all other ethnic groups it is 2 out of 5, and the situation is worse for black and Bangladeshi British people. And whilst there has been an increase in ethnic minority police officers, most are really concentrated in the lower ranks, just 1% in the most senior roles.
Legacy 90.1.
This radio station aims to give a voice to Manchester's African Caribbean community.
It's not a shock to us at all. Racism, inequality.
The top topic on air, the racial disparities in our schools, hospitals, workplaces and criminal justice system.
There's no point in saying this is what the findings are. We want to know what is going to happen, what's going to be implemented and what is going to be put in force to help us out as the black community.
The Prime Minister received a warm welcome at a school in South London until she was challenged by a pupil about police stop and search.
We got stopped and hassled and harassed and asked where we were going.
I was very clear nobody should be stopped and searched on the streets of this country because of the colour of their skin.
She commissioned this audit as part of her fight against what she calls burning injustices. But at this group providing support for isolated Pakistani women in Manchester, they're feeling the effects of government funding cuts.
Theresa May is far removed from the community. She has no idea. Because if you wanted to help the communities, you would be investing in these communities, you would be improving their lives, invest in good housing, education.
Whilst the research shines a spotlight on the racial divides in our society, the stats are nothing new. No new data has been commissioned. Instead, the Prime Minister hopes that by exposing some uncomfortable truths, it sets a challenge for government departments, for business, for schools, to explain or change the inequalities.
But some say not all minorities should be cast as victims.
There is discrimination and racism. I absolutely accept that. I'm not denying it. I've personally experienced it. But I think it's wrong to exaggerate that extent of that. And actually can be very demoralising, demotivating. You know, I think young people should understand that they have so many opportunities, that the ethnic gap is closing in many different areas.
With the facts now transparently published, the hope is there'll be nowhere to hide to ensure that race is never a barrier. Rebecca Barry, News at 10, Manchester.
If you're black, Asian or of an ethnic minority, you're twice as likely to be unemployed. If you're a white teenager, you're 4 times more likely to be a smoker. If you're a black Caribbean school kid, you're 3 times more likely to be excluded from school as your white British classmates, unless you're Roma, who have the highest exclusion rate of all. And if you're Pakistani or white, you're more likely to own your own home than if you're black. If you're living with discrimination, you will, of course, already know all this. The Prime Minister explained today, but her audit on race is intended to show the scale of the challenge to everyone else, to schools, employers and police, to councils, local government services. And her message of what she once called burning injustice was simple. If a disparity can't be explained, it must be changed. The figures today provide no context, no explanation and no solutions. Many are, in fact, not new. So the question perhaps is, where now? Chris Cook reports.
Last year, Theresa May launched an audit of the effects of race on Britain, pledging to hold up a mirror to our society. The data it's brought together lets us move the mirrors, shake the kaleidoscope, see new patterns in Britain's problems and strengths when it comes to ethnicity. Racial fairness was one of the topics the Prime Minister chose to highlight on the day she took office.
That means fighting against the burning injustice that if you're born poor, you will die on average 9 years earlier than others. If you're black, you're treated more harshly by the criminal justice system than if you're white. If you're a white working class boy, you're less likely than anybody else in Britain to go to university.
I've been in public life now for 2 decades. And time and again on issues of race, difference and inequality, it's show me the data, show me the evidence. We've got all that there now today.
We didn't really learn a lot today about race in Britain that we didn't know before, but the process of bringing all that data together does actually matter. For one thing, it makes it much harder for Whitehall not to pay attention to race as an issue. It also shows up consistent holes in our knowledge. For example, we know that minority Britons are much more likely to live in some specific concentrated places. We also know they're more likely to be poorer. And yet this data release showed us how little we understand those interactions between race and place and poverty.
There is some notable stuff in the data. In recent years, the number of stop and searches has declined for white Britons. The same pattern has occurred for Pakistani Britons and black Britons. But look at that. Black Britons have consistently been around 6 times more likely to be stopped than their white neighbours. There are also outcomes that are troubling for minorities. Around 21% of white women have reported recent mental health disorders, a slightly higher share of Asian women, 24%, but it's 29% for black women.
What this report does, it lays bare some of these uncomfortable truths. And if we're bold enough and brave enough to, 1, acknowledge it, acknowledge these truths, and 2, have a plan to close it in 5 or 10 years' time, we can be in a better place. The danger, of course, and I've seen this already today in some circles, is denial.
The data's not all negative for black and Asian Britain. In education, black and Asian children now tend to get roughly the same GCSE points as white kids. Quite an achievement when minority children are more likely to be from poor homes. The data actually highlights that it's British Gypsy and Roma children who suffer the most extreme problems. They get well under half the GCSE points of their peers. But even for those minority groups whose educational outcomes have improved, there are still labour market penalties.
We've all got to take responsibility. When I come into the BBC, am I the only one that notices that all the security guards are black, the receptionists are black, and yet when I come into the well of journalists and technicians, it's spot the black person? Look, I'm not knocking the BBC. This is the same in many other areas. We need to hold a mirror to ourselves and ask those serious questions.
There's good evidence that, bluntly, there are jobs taken by posh white men like me that shouldn't be, and we tend to be overpaid for doing it. But changing that will take a serious heave.
It has never been popular to talk about affirmative action in the context of Europe because, of course, there are white working class and white work-class class communities left behind. But that doesn't mean we can't come up with a formula that lifts all of those groups that are underrepresented. So I do think that's got to be on the political table if we are to redress the balance.
So there's the problem we see in the Prime Minister's mirror. It's a bit like the normal social mobility debate. The logic of going through this data and worrying about groups currently excluded from our elites may be solutions that Britain won't buy.
That was Chris Cook, and in a moment we'll be talking to the First Secretary of State, Damien Green. But first, I'm joined by Magnus Jarber, the Global President and UK CEO of Saatchi & Saatchi, Munira Mirza, who is the Deputy Mayor of London under Boris Johnson, and the writer, comedian and former prison officer, Ava Vidal. It's really nice to have you all here. Thanks for coming in.
Good evening.
Magnus, does this report, does this audit take you somewhere new? Are you pleased to see all this on the table?
I think the report tells me 2 things. The first thing is there is an issue around discrimination, which is an issue about equality in the kind of society we want to live in, where it's founded on beliefs that we're all born equal with equal rights. But there's a second issue for me in there, which is around diversity. And for me, diversity is much more about the potential for our society. And the bit that concerns me is, I believe, running a business, that diverse attitudes, diverse opinions, people who challenge the status quo and come with different solutions, because they come from a different background, take us to another level, another place.
So this is helpful in those terms?
It's helpful in those terms as long as we act, like all data.
Munira?
Well, I'm in favour of publishing data, and I certainly would recognise that there are differences between ethnic groups. That's very well known already. The concern that I have is that the way that the government has framed this report and the publicity and the run-up to the publication today has been a very negative one, very much in terms of the disparities are driven by discrimination, by unfair treatment. There's a bias in the system. The system is not treating people the same. It's not treating them fairly. These are the words that the Prime Minister has used.
It's the language that you don't like.
It's not just the language. It's the way it's the way the report and the government are trying to explain these differences as being about race and discrimination, when in fact there are many different causes and factors. The fact that ethnic groups tend to have a younger age profile, they tend to live in urban areas. Nearly half of the BME population in this country was born abroad, so there are language issues, qualifications.
So do you think it's too superficial then in terms of pointing directly at race?
I think it's... I'm not denying that racism exists and there's discrimination, but I don't think it makes sense to exaggerate the extent of discrimination. And in doing so, I think it can stoke resentment and grievance between communities, and it can also deter ethnic minorities from engaging in public services that they need.
I want to bring you in. You've worked right at the heart of the prison service.
Yes.
What did you see there?
On the report, I mean, even from a year ago when Theresa May first went on her first day in office and she made the declaration, she pointed out the disparity. I just thought to myself, oh wow, if only she'd been Home Secretary for 6 years and been in the position to do something about it. She did nothing about it. These reports come out so often. I mean, I think people like me are just, where are we going to go from here? We had Macpherson. We've had so many of these reports after Toxteth, we've had them after Brixton over the sus laws. Nothing gets done about that. That's the problem that I have. And the problem I have, it seems to me that diversity just seems to be a buzzword. People don't actually really want to get into it and deal with what the actual problems are. And people want to deny that race is a factor. It doesn't make sense to me.
What do you make of Munira's point? I'm going to come back to you, Magnus, but what do you make of Munira's point that actually you create something of a sort of mindset almost? If you keep on talking about burning injustices and unfairness, then you're not actually dealing with the root of the problem. You're just sort of using slightly victim-y phrases.
No, I'm sorry. I don't know where she's coming from with that. I mean, to say that talking about racism causes more racism and causes resentment, it's the actual racism and the actual discrimination that caused the racism, not the talking about it.
Do you recognise that, Magnus?
Well, for me, my attitude to it is that the danger, which I do understand, is you place people in a box. You start telling me because I'm black I'm going to do X, Y, and Z.
Or not achieving as much.
Or I'm not going to achieve. And one of the things I think is important is that we don't use data to then create stereotypes. Because for me, I think about the challenge I had growing up was stereotypes and typecasting, because you create those stereotypes, you create those typecasts, and just like a soap opera actor, if you keep being asked to play the same role, you end up playing that role.
And is that really true, or do you think that you've just failed to recognise injustice if you don't talk about it?
Well, can I give you an example from the package that you just showed, when it talks about the mental health system, the fact that black men and black women present at a much higher rate than the rest of the population or other groups. Now, you could blame the mental health system and call it institutionally racist, which a number of campaigners have done over the last decade. But actually, there are many different reasons why certain ethnic groups, in fact, all ethnic groups present at a much higher rate, to do with their experiences, to do with their age profile, not to do with discrimination and racism. It would be, I think, crazy to expect mental health professionals to have quotas on who they will accept and give treatment to.
Do you recognise that?
And it can actually put off black families from sending their children to get treatment when they need it, because they're terrified of what will happen to their children if they're taken into the system. And I've heard and I've seen research...
It's not about institutional trust,
no,
then?
But we damage that trust, we corrode that trust. I've talked to psychiatrists who say that their black patients won't take treatment, won't take medicine because they're afraid. Now, that can't be good for those people. I know it's designed to help them, but it doesn't lead to better outcomes if that happens.
I can see you shaking your head. So.
In terms of the mental health, it is institutional racist, and you have to understand there are cultural differences. I worked in the prison service. I remember one day being on the landing and there being a guy talking, and they said to me, take him to the hospital, a black man. Take him to the hospital. And I said, why? And they said, well, he's obviously mad. I said, he's not mad. He's Jamaican. He hasn't combed his hair. He hasn't got any manners. But he's not mad. They're quick to label because of the way that black people and certain minorities might express themselves in a different way. So
it is cultural then, or...?
Sometimes it can be cultural. Sometimes, yes, it can be. You can be labelled as you know, I think just to say that black people would be scared to go into the system because of this data.
There's academic research in this area. There's a distinguished professor, Swaran Singh, who's at Warwick University, who's done extensive research based on his own clinical experience and
what is the background of these professors?
Well, I mean, I'm very happy to provide it, but the point being that this is not just me making it up based on my personal anecdotes. There is a huge amount of data that shows that migrant groups experience mental illness, not just in Britain, actually in many countries around the world, at a much higher rate.
Racism can damage your mental health, and people don't take that into account.
We've run out of time on this one, but I'm going to raise some of this now with the Minister. Thank you all very much for coming in. Here with us now, First Secretary of State Theresa May's right-hand man, Damien Green. Can I ask you, do you think that Britain has a problem of race? You've heard this argument, you've listened to it. Is this about just sort of cultural misunderstanding, or is it something more institutionalised?
No, it has some problems. The advantage of pulling together this information, which no other country in the world has done in this form, is that we can now actually look at it in quite a fine-grained way. I think there's a danger of saying, oh, it's all institutional racism, or...
But would you still call it burning injustice? Because that was a very strong
there are
phrase,
clearly
wasn't it,
injustices out there. You just look at those, some of those figures. But the point is that it's different in different areas. There are different problems, different ethnic groups perform in different ways, some better than the white British majority. And clearly what's key is that we use this information actually to make a difference. And I do think it's monstrously unfair to say that nothing has been done over 6 years. You saw that Chris Cook chart of what happened to stop and search for black men. That used to be 110 per thousand. And because of Theresa May, it's now down to 30 per thousand. That's a third of the level it used to be. That is a genuine change.
I work with the Stop and Search Legal Project. I'm sorry, it's just...
You don't believe the figures?
Sorry?
You don't believe the figures?
I don't believe it's because... You're saying to me it's unfair what I'm saying about Theresa May. I don't believe that's unfair. I don't believe it's been down to her. Theresa May was Home Secretary in charge of some of the most racist policies, immigration policy. She was the one who had the go-home vans going around the streets.
What's that got to do with stop and search? Are you denying those stop and search figures? Those stop and search figures are true.
OK, Ava raises a very important point, and I want to take you to a letter, because this picks up on it. When Theresa May was the Equalities Minister, Minister for Women Equalities, she wrote to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, in June of 2010, and she said, I fully share the objective of spending cuts. Equally important is fairness at the heart of those decisions. There are real risks that women, ethnic minorities, disabled people and older people will be disproportionately affected. In other words, she saw all those years ago that some of the policies of austerity that were being implemented by your government would disproportionately affect black and ethnic minorities. And yet your government went ahead with those cuts.
Well, we had to, I mean, the country was going broke, so we had to take those economic decisions. What we did also, though, and again you can see this in some of those figures, is make sure that the spending we did was spent effectively and was spent in the right areas. One of the things we've seen is much better performance, for instance, in schools by many children from ethnic minority backgrounds. That's because we've changed our school system.
For example, about a disproportionate number of young black men in need of mental health help. Your own stats showed BME people more likely to be on low incomes. Your government froze working age benefits. Now, that disproportionately hurts them. Do you accept that?
Well, whether you're on benefits or not often depends on whether you're in a job or not. One of the things we've done is not only increase the general level of employment to historically high levels, but actually one of the good things, there's a lot of bad news in this report, but there's some good news, specifically on employment, that the gap between some of the most disadvantaged ethnic minorities and the majority has narrowed in the employment space.
But if you look at your policies continually about benefits, or, for example, a cap on child tax credit hits families with more than 2 children, we know that BME women typically live in larger families. They are more affected. I'll give you another one. Cuts to local housing allowance, housing benefit. BME families are more likely to be on low incomes in urban areas. It hurts them more.
You're assuming that minority families are going to live on benefits all their lives.
I'm just saying that many of your policies disproportionately affect black and ethnic minorities that you say today you're going all out to help because there's burning injustice. And if you change the policies at the heart of your government's plan, you would help yourself to help these people.
No, I don't agree with that, because if you spend money you haven't got, then all you do is wreck the economy.
This is not me. This is the Runnymede Trust, who found that cumulative effects of those cuts left the poorest Asian women more than £2,000 worse off. What part of that do you not agree with?
The Runnymede Trust were around the table at Downing Street today welcoming what we're doing.
Well, of course they are, because they're saying if people at the bottom of the pile are worse affected, you have to do something to help them, don't you?
But just saying spend more money, give more benefits. That's
Think
that's what we've done traditionally for a society that didn't help the most disadvantaged. The best route out of poverty, and clearly, some of these groups have got disproportionate exposure to poverty, if you like. The best route out of poverty is to have a job. That's why one of the policy announcements we've made today...
But it's a crazy phrase that to say exposure to poverty.
It's not a crazy phrase.
They're worse off,
yes,
and your policies are making them worse off. You could reverse those changes.
We're reversing the effects of poverty by allowing them, encouraging them to get into work. All you're talking about is benefits. You just think if you keep giving people benefits, you get them out of poverty. The best way to get people out of poverty long term and give them more control over their own lives is to allow them to get a job.
So you don't think austerity has been particularly damaging to the people you're trying to help today?
During that period of austerity, what we've seen is more people from minority communities get into work. There's a lot more to go, but if you look at these figures, you see that 10 years ago, 60% of black people in work. Now that's up to 67%. That's still not high enough. It's 72% for white people, but that's a lot better than it was. That's through the period that you are bad-mouthing.
So when you are heading into this budget, and you're the minister in charge of driving through this budget, are you going to look at any of those policies in particular and say, we could actually make an important difference? Or are you just going to say employment seems to be sorting things out, so we'll leave the austerity cuts where they are?
Well, we look at all those policies all the time.
But you've got a budget coming up next month.
But as I say, your basic assumption is that the more money you spend on benefits, the more you help people.
My basic assumption is that you've put the data on the table today, and you've let people see where the problems are. And I'm suggesting to you, it's not enough just to see where the problems are. Your government is the one that's meant to be sorting out the problems.
Indeed, and that's why today, in 3 areas, there'll obviously be more announcements, but in 3 areas, we've said that the Department for Work and Pensions will identify 20 particular unemployment hotspots where it particularly affects minority communities. There's a raft of things in the criminal justice system, including the fact that prison officers, like they ever used to be, I think 6% of them are from minority communities and about 25%
It's very hard there now, isn't it?
And we need to
When I worked in the prison service, and first thing I noticed when I went through the remand wing, which is the unconvicted prisoners, it was 93% black. There's disparity. I think if we concentrate on benefits and we concentrate on jobs, it's taking away the fact that racism permeates every single part of society. He will be likely to be stopped and searched if he's driving a nice car. The police would stop him as well as any other black person. Footballers get stopped as well. So I think to make it all economical is a mistake, because there's other areas.
Think about, you're not spending money on ethnic minorities, you might just be investing in a greater and more diverse Britain.
And that's precisely why we're
you see it
trying
as
to
spending, not investing.
Get them into it. Well,
that's what you've talked about.
It can be both. I mean, investments can either work.
But the point is, we're talking about spending or changing.
It's more than just economic. It does involve things like the prison service.
Isn't the elephant in the room here that at the moment your party is paralysed, isn't it? You are weak and you're riven by divides and your majority is unworkable, and you might come in as you did a year ago with this wonderful domestic will and policy and platform. You can't execute any of that now.
Well, we can. I mean, and we're doing it today. We've published this, which is, as I say, it's a world first. Nobody's done anything like this before. We've announced in 3
Well, you say it's a world first.
I
mean, you heard from Magnus, who said it's lovely to see all this stuff, but you know, you don't particularly need to see the stuff on the table. It's most of it is not that new.
I really disagree with that. I think you always need to have as many facts at your disposal before you take a decision.
The facts is the step for you to then jump off and say, and now.
Exactly
right. So, and now is what?
Well, and now, as I said, I've already mentioned 2 of the policy areas. We mentioned exclusions. One of the other policies we've announced today is an external look at exclusion, not from inside the Department for Education, so that we can get to grips with why certain groups are particularly excluded. And of course, there will be more to come. There has to be more to come. There has to be more from the Home Office and from other departments as well. But we've now, this isn't a once-off thing. This is a permanent resource, not just for us, but for the whole of society, to hold both central government to account and, incidentally, other parts. It holds up a mirror to the whole of society, so the private sector, the charities, local government and so on. Everyone will be able to see how all those sectors are performing.
And before you go, I want to ask you something, because we are very dominated and you are very constrained in terms of domestic policy by, of course, what you have to do on Brexit. Theresa May was asked today if she'd support Brexit if the question were asked again today, and she couldn't answer it. You can.
Well, I was on the board of the Stronger In campaign. Nobody fought harder than me for Remain, so I don't resolve from my views. But I mean, it's a slightly silly question because there's not going to be another referendum today.
So when you say you don't resolve from your views that you think the country is better if it remains?
It would have been, but the public took their view.
It would have been, or it would be.
I'm a Democrat. I believe that if people have spoken, it's the job of democratic politicians to do their best, actually, to put in place what people wanted. People voted for Brexit.
But can you say, hand on heart, Brexit was the right decision for the country now?
Well, I argued against it, but the country took the decision. I'm a Democrat. I respect that decision. It's my public duty now to try and make the best Brexit we can, and that's what I'm trying to do in government.
Damien Green, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks for coming in.